with for several years now, and we get to hear great speakers on great topics supporting biblical creation. That's what we're going to be hearing tonight. I'm going to let Heinz Leklama, the leader slash director slash president slash whatever else title we can give him of Apologetics Forum, come up to introduce, and our speaker, Michael Lord.
Thank you. Yeah, we've been here a number of times before to bring in speakers. My name is Heinz Leklama, and I head up the Apologetics Forum. And we bring in speakers. Actually, in Arlington, where we're based, we have a speaker once a month, the fourth Friday of every month. And then four times a year, we bring in a speaker from outside, and we have them speaking from Wednesday night all the way through to Sunday night, which is here. So Michael Lord has been speaking for, I think, 10 different sessions at different churches and some Christian schools. So it's not a vacation for them. It's a real working environment. We appreciate his ministry. For those of you that are not familiar with the Apologetics Forum, we have books and other resources out in the back table when we're done here. Take a look at this flyer, this brochure. And it's the apologeticsforum.org on the website, and you can find about all upcoming meetings and other things that we provide. We have a lot of resources on there. We have a menu item called Find Answers, and if somebody has a question on some biblical creation issue, just type in the question in the Find Answers box, and you get a slew of articles from a biblical perspective as answers to that question. And Michael Lord he studied in meteorology, calling out your weather, for 30 years. He's got a master's degree in that, and he's spent almost 50 years in parallel with his career, but also now full-time, doing creation research based on our understanding of the book of Genesis, on origins, and other scientific issues, which he will get into in a minute. We have, for those of you that are not on our mailing list and you want to be, on the table, there's a sign-up sheet. Just put down your name and your email address and get informed of all the upcoming meetings that we have and the speakers we're bringing in and the new stuff we have. And there's other stuff on our tables, which we'll get into at the end. So I'm going to introduce Mike in a minute, but let me just open up a word of prayer first, and then we'll have Mike speak. Father, we come to you just to thank you for this time. We thank you for Mike and Beverly's ministry. Thank you for coming out here to minister among us at the different schools and churches, and we appreciate that. And as he speaks here tonight, Lord, we just ask you to give him the words to use to reach our hearts and to use the information that we gather from that so we can share the reasons for what we believe with others, whether it be family members, colleagues, etc. And we just thank you for that. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. So Michael is going to speak on the topic on the origins of the Grand Canyon. He has already, and Wednesday night he covered about the Ice Age, and on Saturday morning he covered about the evidence that we have that God left for us in his creation for the Noah's flood. There really is a lot of evidence for that, and Mike will add to that here. Mike?
Well, good evening. I'm actually from Seattle, Washington originally, and went to the University of Washington and got my degree in atmospheric science, 2 degrees there. And as you learn something new in this topic, I'm going to learn something new. I've never used a tablet. And I've never used this operating system you have. I use PowerPoint, but this is a different one. So I'm going to be learning. I might be fumbling around. One thing that this system doesn't do is in PowerPoint, you have slides, you can hit hide slides and it doesn't show up in a presentation. Well, this doesn't do it. So I got to figure out which ones I hid. Well, luckily in this talk, I have very few that I've hid. But if I had the dinosaur talk, I have 75% of the slides are hidden. I really have a lot of trouble. I'd have 250 slides and I only pick about 60 of them, see, just depending on the situation. So anyway, okay, we'll try this thing. Anyway, the topic is, what is the origin of a Grand Canyon? We'll start with an overview or a summary. This is what I'm going to talk about. Grand Canyon is a major mystery to uniformitarian mystery. In other words, it's a mystery to secular science who use something called uniformitarianism, where that's how they explain all the rocks and fossils out there. For me to understand what you know, how many of you know what uniformitarianism is? Very few, okay. That is the secular way of explaining all the geological observations within that idea. It says we only use uniform processes we see going on today to explain all the rocks and the fossils. Present processes like what? Oh, a river flood, and then depositing sediments in a delta. So those are the processes you see going on today, and that's all you can use to explain the rocks and fossils. And let me tell you, the rocks and fossils defy that principle, but that is the major assumption they've used for well over 200 years to explain all geology. But I'm saying by that assumption, one of the things they can't explain is the origin of Grand Canyon. Also, us creation scientists have several ideas on the origin of Grand Canyon. We have enough geologists and sophistication that we have multiple theories on some things and some controversy. So I'm going to make a case that the dam breach hypothesis has fatal problems. I'll explain what the dam breach hypothesis is. Third, Grand Canyon is a water gap. I'll explain what a water gap is. Well, essentially it's a gorge through a mountain range, but we'll get into that in more detail as I go. And it formed by late flood channelized erosion. It formed in the flood by late flood channelized erosion. So we'll flesh out all that as we go. So I'm going to dismiss the secular ideas right away. They've been studying it for 150 plus years, trying to figure out the origin of it, and you know, they're stuck. They've been stuck for that long, and they haven't moved. And I'm just going to use some quotes from some recent books by secular scientists on the Grand Canyon. Here's one. Surprisingly, what had seemed to pioneers, that is, pioneers in geology, to be an easily geological puzzle to solve, proved just the opposite. Powell and Dutton, those are some geologists from the 1800s, would have been taken aback to learn that 65 years after the Major's maiden voyage, this Major Powell was the first one to float Grand Canyon. Everyone thought he was going to die, but he made it. Well, not all of them made it, but he made it through there. And he'd be surprised that the river's age and history were still open questions. And he floated it, I think, in 1869. They would have been astounded to find that the origin of Grand Canyon was the subject of a conference held in 1964, which reached a consensus. Oh yeah, watch out for consensus in science, but not unanimity. And that yet another convened in the year 2000 with the same result. They don't know. Now here's a quote from a man named William Ranney. He spent his whole life studying the Grand Canyon. In 2005, these are from books. He says, the canyon's birth is shrouded in hazy mystery, cloaked in intrigue, and filled with enigmatic puzzles. And although the Grand Canyon is one of the world's most recognizable landscapes, it is remarkable how little is known about the details of its origin. So they really don't know. So I'm not going to get into their ideas. I'm just going to get into our ideas. How do we explain it? See, with 50 years of research I've done, the Lord has led me not to challenge evolution and talk a lot about evolution, because if you know a little bit about evolution, and we have resources for that, it's really easy to do. It really is. When I got out of graduate school, I decided to check on it. I believe God existed, but if evolution was true, I was going to become a theistic evolution, marrying evolution as creation. But when I examined it, I found hardly any evidence, if any, to back up evolution. So why should I believe in evolution or theistic evolution if evolution's not true? So I don't hardly speak on that. The Lord has led me to answer questions and challenges that the secular scientists give us. So that's what I've been doing for 50 years. So my major thrust has been on the Ice Age, and there's a lot of questions with the Ice Age. There's mammoths, there's ice cores, there's lots of things to do with the Ice Age, which I've dealt with in the past. And so from then I went into geology. So the Lord led me to answer questions. One of the challenges is, how would we explain Grand Canyon? And so we have generally four hypotheses. Three of them are dam breach hypothesis. What that has meant is that to the east of Grand Canyon, you have these lakes after the flood. And these lakes either broke through right away after the flood and carved Grand Canyon, a dam breach essentially, or they waited for 100 or 200 years, rose up, and then breached. So there's three types of this dam breach hypothesis. And the fourth one is the one I believe late flood channelized erosion carved it. So the dam breach idea is a post-flood idea. And I originally believed this until I went down to study the Grand Canyon, and I floated it twice. I've hiked down it once. That was in one day and back. That was horrendous. The worst thing is going down. My calves were so sore, it felt good going uphill. I'd never do that again. I was with my son, and he was mad at me for quite a while. Anyway, I'm not going to talk about two of these because they're not considered viable by hardly any creation scientists. I'm going to talk about Steve Austin's dam breach hypothesis. That's the one I'm going to focus in on. And I'm going to show that it has fatal problems. Okay, this is what it looks like. Anyway, you form these lakes east of Grand Canyon. And there's a major barrier at the east entrance part of Grand Canyon. It's called the Kaibab Uplift. It's a plateau that's 9,200 feet on the north rim, and it slopes down and forms what's called the Coconino Plateau. And the Grand Canyon's actually carved high up, as I'll make a mention. And this kind of blocks the rivers when the Grand Canyon supposedly wasn't there after the flood for about 100 or 200 years. And two lakes now broke through, they claim, and then carved Grand Canyon. Now there's a third lake up there, Lake Uinta, which Steve Austin doesn't believe was part of the dam breach hypothesis anymore. So I normally would talk about that, but we're not going to talk about it at all because he doesn't believe. But so there's two lakes. He calls them Uinta, Hopi Lake and Canyonlands Lake. Okay. They're not there now, of course. They breached, emptied, carved Grand Canyon. That's the idea. How many have heard of the dam breach hypothesis? Several of you have. Okay. Pardon me if I fumble around. I'm technologically challenged, by the way. But I'm learning something new. Anyway, I'm going to make a point that there's three fatal flaws in the dam breach hypothesis. By the way, this is a hypothesis I originally believed until I went down there to check it out. Anyway, number one, there's no evidence that the lakes actually existed. What do we need for evidence? We need shorelines, and we need bottom sediments. Those two things to show that the lakes actually existed in the past. Number two, the lake should have breached the low points across the Kaibab Plateau, the low points, but it didn't. It's through the intermediate altitude, which is one of the major problems that the secular scientists have had. Why did it do that? And there are side canyons to Grand Canyon, Kanab Canyon and Havasu Canyon that come into Grand Canyon and end up at the same level as the Grand Canyon. And with the dam breach hypothesis, that should not occur. So I'm going to flesh those out coming up. And so I'm going to go back to the first one there and show there's no evidence for the lake. And I'm going to start with the shorelines that should be there. Now, on the other side of the Kaibab Plateau in the Great Basin, during the Ice Age, which is when the Grand Canyon would have breached, we had all kinds of lakes, as you see there. So even Death Valley had a lake 600 feet deep. And you see Great Salt Lake there? Well, during the Ice Age, Great Salt Lake is 12 feet deep on the average. But during the Ice Age, you had a Lake Bonneville that was 800 feet deep and about 8 to 10 times the size of Great Salt Lake. And you had other lakes all through there. It was a wet area during the Ice Age, which is another difficulty for you secular Ice Age ideas. So with those lakes, they produce some nice shorelines that we can still see as we drive around. So we should see shorelines with the other lakes on the east side of the Kaibab Plateau if those lakes really existed. The shoreline should be there. So let's take a look at some of the shorelines. You can see the linear features down there. This is around Salt Lake. If you've ever driven down that way, they're very distinctive and very large. And there's some high deltas too that are very large. Very distinctive. That's from Lake Bonneville, when that lake filled up there. And you know, Lake Bonneville rose during the Ice Age and actually overtopped a pass, Red Rock Pass at the Idaho border, and broke through on the Snake River and formed a flood called the Bonneville Flood that lasted 6 weeks. And the area where it overtopped dropped about 350 feet. So there was a massive flood through southern Idaho on the Snake River when Lake Bonneville dropped 350 feet. So you can go to, there were lakes in southeast Oregon. These places are very dry today. You can see the shorelines at the lower part, right in there. Those are shorelines from lakes during the Ice Age. They're still there. And these are shorelines in Death Valley, from a lake 600 feet deep in Death Valley. They show up. And if you know where Mono Lake is, near Bishop, California, that's a kind of a dried up playa lake now. It has a lot of salt deposits around it. How many have been to Mono Lake? Not too many, just a few of you. But anyway, during the Ice Age, you had a lake 800 feet deep, deeper there, and they call it Lake Russell. And you can see the shoreline of it right down the lower part. And those mountains there are glacial moraines. So we know that these lakes were high during the Ice Age because it cut the shoreline on the glacial moraine. Help? What happened? Okay, anyway. How many have heard of Glacial Lake Missoula and the Missoula flood? Several of you. That happened in your great state, mostly. Anyway, this is kind of a kiosk you see at Lake Pend Oreille in northern Idaho. The lake formed when the Clark Fork River was blocked by a finger of the ice sheet in northern Idaho. This finger of the ice sheet was 2,500 feet deep because the mountains to the east and west were not glaciated at the top. And it backed up the Clark Fork River, forming a lake 2,000 feet deep at the Idaho-Montana border, 1,000 feet deep over the city of Missoula, Montana, about 4 times the volume of Lake Erie collected, and it was dammed by ice. And you know, it's not going to stay that way for very long. There was another lake dammed on the Columbia River called I can't see this thing very well. Anyway, I think it might be Glacial Lake Columbia, near Spokane and westward. Anyway, Glacial Lake Missoula broke through the ice, filled up Glacial Lake Columbia that overtopped a ridge and spread the water down through eastern Washington, carving up eastern Washington, eroding 50 cubic miles of silt and hard basalt. And the green area you see on the left, in fact, I'm going to show you a satellite picture of this, is the path of the flood. And the brown areas are areas missed. That's the Lake Missoula flood. Now, there's shorelines all over the western valleys of Montana from Glacial Lake Missoula. First of all, let's take a look at the path of the flood. That's the path. There's 2 major paths, the Cheney-Palouse path and the path down through Grand Coulee, formed by the Lake Missoula flood. And it missed a lot of areas, you can see. And anyway, that's the Lake Missoula flood during the peak of the Ice Age. And by the way, J. Harlan Bretz pointed that flood. J. Harlan Bretz pointed that flood out from his detective work in eastern Washington, looking at Dry Falls and places like that. Said there was a monstrous flood there, but he didn't know where it came from. He didn't know for 10 years. And guess what? Even after he knew, no one believed him except possibly one guy, Joseph Pardee, who worked in Montana, knew where it came from, but he kept his mouth shut because he was employed by the U.S. Geological Survey, and as a result, he probably might have lost his job if he piped up saying, oh, there was a massive lake in western Montana, and that's what caused Bretz's flood. He kept quiet, and everybody rejected it for 40 years. For 40 years, and you know what the main reason they rejected the Lake Missoula flood, despite hundreds of pieces of evidence in eastern Washington, is because it was too biblical in scale. Too biblical. I got quotes in my Lake Missoula flood talk on this. That's the reason. So their bias is powerful and strong against the Genesis flood. I don't expect them to see evidence for the Genesis flood, even when it's staring them in the face, because of their bias and blindness. Okay, Glacial Lake Missoula had shorelines in both hard and soft rocks. There they are right there. This is above the University of Montana in Missoula. And you can hike up there. They're about 30 to 40 feet vertically apart. So what I believe that they're formed by, but the peak of the Ice Age, it was starting to melt and filling up those valleys fast, 30 or 40 feet a year. And it raised, and in wintertime it stood still, and that's when you carved the shoreline, rose another 30 or 40 feet, and protecting the shorelines below. They have to be protected once they form. So it finally reached a peak and then burst through, and the Lake Missoula flood lasted about 5 days. Now think of what you can do with the Genesis flood. What if you extrapolated the Lake Missoula flood by 10,000 times? You can get an idea how powerful the Genesis flood was. So you should see the shorelines with these lakes if the dam breach was true, but you don't. You don't find any shorelines, and they should be there because they're on the other side of the mountains. Glacial Lake Missoula, that lasted only a short time, maybe 60 years, shorelines. There's no reason why the shorelines should be gone, but they're gone. I would say that's pretty powerful evidence the lakes never existed. Also, when lakes form, you know, the erosion from the sides would fill up the bottom with bottom sediments. So there should be several hundred feet thick of bottom lake sediments for these lakes if they really existed. For instance, when Lake Bonneville dried out, it left a lot of lake sediments. In this case, it produced the Bonneville Salt Flats, where they do a lot of those high-speed races to try to break records. So there should be bottom sediments there, and there are no bottom sediments. So when I realized that, I realized those lakes never existed. You got to have some lakes before you can have a dam breach. And by the way, I'm about the only one in the creation science that's really studied a real dam breach. That's the Lake Missoula flood, which is a real dam breach. So I know what dam breaches do. So I'm only talking about 3 fatal problems. I think there's about 3 more, and there's about 6 that are difficult that they might be able to explain by adding hypotheses. So there's many difficulties with this dam breach hypothesis. I'm only giving you what I think are the 3 best fatal arguments against the dam breach hypothesis. But some people say, well, maybe when the dam breached, all those bottom sediments got eroded out. Well, we can analyze that really easy. Now, this is one of the lakes. This is called Lake Hopi. I wish I had a scale on this. It's probably 100 miles long and probably about 50 miles wide. It's big. And then when you see those arrows I have in there, that big arrow, that's going through the narrow slot canyon to drain into the Colorado River where Grand Canyon is. So the water had to go through there. And it'd be going really fast if there was such a dam breach. But because it's so narrow, it's not going to be going very fast up in the lake. You see, it's going to be going through fast in the narrow slot canyon, which I'll show you a picture of. It's a little Colorado River, and this is where it enters the Colorado River in Grand Canyon, a slot canyon 1/2 mile deep. The water, if the dam breach was true, it would be going fast through there, but be so slow in the lake that it can't erode the bottom sediments. The bottom sediments should be there, and they are not. And here is a picture of the slot canyon of the little Colorado River. That's one part. And you can see it from the top right in here. You can just see how narrow that is? I mean, the water would be rushing through there, of course, because it's so narrow, but it's not going to be enough to erode any sediments at all. And of course, they claim there is some sediments in the northeast part of the lake called the Bidahochi Formation. A formation is sediments that are very similar, like a sand or sandstone, so they call that a formation. But there's a lot of problems with this formation. First of all, a lot of it's near and above where the lake is supposed to be. It's higher than the lake is supposed to be. Also, it's mostly volcanic and fluvial, as they call it. Fluvial mean from rivers. So the lake part of this formation is considered a playa lake, which is a dried up little lake that has a lot of salt deposits as a result, like Mono Lake. So this formation doesn't really qualify as any bottom sediments. So there's really no evidence for the lakes. Number 2, if there were lakes, and we know that they would have risen during the Ice Age because there was heavy precipitation in that area, they should have breached at the low points across that Kaibab Plateau, but they don't. Okay, here's some geography there. There's the Kaibab Plateau. And the low points are to the north, where those big arrows are, and to the south. And to the south, that low point's about 6,500 feet above sea level. The northern arrow is at a pass between Kanab and Powell that is 5,700 feet. But Grand Canyon, as you see, was cut through. This is color-coded for altitude, by the way. The East Kaibab Plateau is up to 9,200 feet. But Grand Canyon was cut at an intermediate altitude through that plateau. 8,200 feet on the north rim and 7,500 feet on the south rim. Why the difference? Because the plateau slopes down to the south. So it was carved at the lowest point at 7,500 feet. It should have went through to the north at 5,700 feet or to the south 6,500 feet. It did not do that. Why was it carved at such high altitude across the Kaibab Plateau? They don't know, and this is one of the problems why secular scientists has so many problems. One of the major reasons. So, another fatal problem is it. Okay. So, that's the second fatal problem. The third is long tributary canyons coming down. If Grand Canyon breached through from a post-flood lake, rivers and streams that were on the top of it should be hanging valleys for the drainage there. And here they are. Kanab Canyon starts up at Kanab, Utah, about 60 miles long, and Havasu Canyon, it's almost 60 miles long, and it carves all the way down to Grand Canyon. Now, if those drainages were there before Grand Canyon was carved, they'd be hanging valleys. We see those in the Lake Missoula flood, by the way. A lot of hanging valleys after the Lake Missoula flood carved up eastern Washington, forming coulees. But the fact that the drainage goes all the way down to the Grand Canyon is like what we expect in a normal drainage when you have a flood over a wide area. You have one main channel, and then you have side channels, tributaries that go into it down to the level of the main channel. So this would imply that water was up at Kanab, Utah, and way down into central Arizona, about 120 miles wide, to form this pattern. But it wasn't. It only carved Grand Canyon. In fact, where Kanab Creek comes this is Havasu Creek, comes into Grand Canyon, it's a mile-high slot canyon, very deep. And then on the other side, where you have Kanab Canyon, it's the same thing, a slot canyon. So, three fatal flaws. So, I wondered, well, then how would Grand Canyon form? It didn't form by the dam breach idea. Well, getting back to my summary, the dam breach hypothesis has fatal problems. Well, number one, Grand Canyon is a water gap. What is a water gap precisely? It's essentially a gorge through a mountain range where the river starts on one side of the mountains and passes through the mountains to the other side. There are thousands of water gaps across the earth, thousands. A lot of them in the western U.S. Some of them close to where you live is the Yakima River from Ellensburg down past Yakima. It goes through about 5 lava ridges when it could have easily gone around if the river carved the canyon, which it didn't. See, rivers don't go uphill and down to carve the canyon. That's a water gap near you. That's your closest water gaps. Take a drive from Ellensburg through the old highway. Ellensburg Canyon is very windy, of course, and you'll see some of the water gaps. In fact, the secular science have a little kiosk at the last one before you get into Sela that tells you how they think it happened. Yeah, it's sitting there, it's on a stone, so you can see what they believe. They have 4 ideas to form water gaps, but all of them have serious problems. But so let's take a look at some other water gaps in the West. There are many in the West. You know, the Appalachian Mountains have 1,700 water gaps that go through ridges. 1,700 in the Appalachians alone, where the river could have easily gone around that, but instead it cuts through the mountain. Here's one close to where I live at Cody, Wyoming. What you're looking at are the Rattlesnake Mountains. They're about 2,500 feet high. And you see that gorge where that car is heading for? That's the water gap. The Shoshone River starts in southeast Yellowstone Park and heads east down the valley. And then when it gets to the Rattlesnake Mountains, it could have easily gone around 2 miles around in a low area, which I'm going to show a picture of, and out, if the river had anything to do with this. But instead, the Shoshone River just continues on going east and passes right through the Rattlesnake Mountains, as if they weren't there. Now, rivers don't normally do that, so rivers obviously didn't carve this, and I'll show you what did. Now, we drove through the water gap, and they made a dam there called Buffalo Bill Reservoir. You can see the water gap to the left there, and you can see to the right there is how low it is. In fact, it's so low they had to build a dam there so the water wouldn't go out into the Bighorn Basin from the dam. And of course, that's where they start the irrigation for the Bighorn Basin. So why did that water gap form? Well, they got hypotheses, but you can check those and they don't make any sense whatsoever. You know, and rivers do a lot of crazy things. When John Wesley Powell first floated the Grand Canyon in 1869, he floated the Green River from Green River, Utah. And the Green River heads south and hits the Uinta Mountains. And the Uinta Mountains are 14,000 feet tall. And they're cored in the middle with hard quartzite. Anyway, the Green River starts heading into the mountains and then comes out a half a mile away in a valley. Why do rivers do that? They don't. These weren't formed by uniformitarianism. So it went in and out. And then finally, the Green River could have easily flowed around the Uinta Mountains in a low area to come into the Colorado River. But did it do that? No, it starts heading east a bit and then suddenly takes a right-hand turn and cuts through the edge of the Uinta Mountains, forming a slot canyon a half a mile deep. And here it is, the gates of Lodore. This is the Green River flowing into the mountains through the Uinta Mountains. And they're stuck on how this occurs. And here's one of those water gaps in the Appalachian Mountains. This is looking north from Harrisburg, Pennsylvania, through the Susquehanna River comes through that gap, but there's a series of about 3 gaps you can't see, kind of aligned, kind of curved. They're aligned but curved. And the river should have went around these ridges, but they end up going through. There's thousands of water gaps across the earth. And here's one through the Alaska Range. The Nenana River starts south of the Alaska Range, which goes up to about 20,000 feet. Denali's on the left there. It starts south of the Alaska Range and ends up going through a water gap to end up in the Tanana River that flows through Fairbanks. That's a water gap, a big, deep water gap. The deepest water gaps are through the Himalaya Mountains. Rivers start on the southern Tibetan Plateau. They start flowing south towards the Indian Ocean. And then when they hit the Himalaya Mountains, the Himalayas divert it sometimes, but then they suddenly just cut right through the Himalayas. There's one water gap through the Himalayas that's 4 miles deep. the Arun River, A-R-U-N, I don't know how you pronounce that. It's east of Mount Everest, 4 miles deep water gap. The Zagros Mountains of southwest Iran have 300 water gaps. Those mountains, the water gaps are as deep as 8,000 feet. And a guy wrote a PhD thesis on it and published it and called the Zagros Streams. And I laughed my way through that when he described the path of these streams. Apparently I don't have the quote here, but I quote it in other talks. He simply says that streams and rivers do not go down the valleys like they're supposed to do very often. They love to cut through the mountains and then come back out to the same mountain again and do it again. In fact, he used statements like, it seems that some rivers seek obstacles or mountains to transect. I laughed my way through it. In the Grand Canyon area, there are 11 water gaps that I show right there. Those are water gaps of various sorts. So the Grand Canyon is just another water gap, carved by the same mechanism which I will show you that other water gaps are formed. And by the way, Grand Canyon is not the deepest water gap in North America. The deepest water gap is Hell's Canyon, between Oregon and Idaho, where the Snake River in southern Idaho should have continued out into southern Oregon. But instead it takes a right-hand turn and goes 50 miles through mountains. On the Idaho side, it's 8,000 feet deep, water gap. Why does the river do that? Why did it get through there, those mountains? They don't know. They have ideas. So that's Hell's Canyon is the deepest. The Grand Canyon is distinctive by being the longest water gap in the world. It's about 200 and some odd miles long, but it's not the deepest in North America, and it's not the deepest around the world by far. There's a lot deeper ones. So how did water gaps form in the flood? Well, actually, it's fairly easy. They formed when the waters were running off the continents. See, the continents were coming up out of the floodwaters. Psalm 104:8 says, the mountains rose, the valleys sank down to drain the floodwaters. And I believe it happened on a continental scale and ocean scale. So the continents were coming up, or the ocean basins were sinking, and the water was rushing off at high speeds. And me and 3 others have added a long research project trying to figure out how much erosion occurred when the waters were running off. And based on the sediments that collected along the continental shelf, which averaged 10,000 feet, we estimated that 5,000 feet of erosion on the average occurred on the continents as the floodwaters ran off. So they're running off, the land was coming up, so you have a ridge here, and you have a wide current going across it. But then there's low areas in there, and it's going to tend to speed up and eat out those low areas. Like that. When you expose part of the ridge, it's going to force the water to funnel around there. It's going to have to accelerate because you have the same amount of water that was going over the ridge now funneling through a few locations, channelized. And of course it has to accelerate because it's like water, forcing water through a wide pipe to flow through a narrow pipe. It has to speed up for the same amount of water to go through. And by the way, erosion is approximately the 4th power of the velocity. So if you double the velocity, the erosion rate goes up 16 times. That's 2 to the 4th power. So, and by the way, you probably had cavitation also in this pattern. So you're going to form these gorges rapidly. They're going to form rapidly. And as time goes on, it lowers, and all the water is going through 2 areas there. And for some reason, the one on the left gives up. This is a schematic. Why did it give up? Well, the currents change, and maybe other mountains are poking up and forcing the water to change direction somewhat, so that when it's all over with, you have a water gap that's carved down to where the water can actually pass through, and then one didn't get carved down far enough, and that's called a wind gap. There are thousands of wind gaps through mountain ranges across the earth, as well as water gaps. So, Grand Canyon is a water gap, and it's formed by the same way water gaps are formed, the thousands of other water gaps. Why say Grand Canyon special for these dam breaches that you don't have the evidence for? Okay, now I'm going to go through how I think it happened. And actually, the origin of Grand Canyon is actually a 5-part problem. You got to get the canyon through the Kaibab Plateau, the first plateau that's blocking everything to the east. It's got to go through there at intermediate altitudes, not the low point, at intermediate. That's the number one problem. And then when you do break through, it doesn't go down the topographic slope like a normal drainage would do. It hugs the southwest edge of the Kaibab Plateau at the same altitude as where it broke through. That's a really strange thing. And then suddenly it's diverted west, carved west, number 3, and then it turns abruptly southward and then northwest. I wish I had my pointer here, but I don't. You can see, well, anyway, to demonstrate this, I made blue figures. This is supposed to represent this all happening underwater. That's why it's blue. So what I believe happened is that you had 2 major currents when it was draining to the west towards the Pacific Ocean. You had, number 1 was going down the Little Colorado River Valley, and there was no obstructions until you got to Grand Canyon area. But number 2 was formed by drainage through side canyons, and it came down, and I believe they converged at the point where it broke through the Kaibab Plateau. And when you converge currents, they have to accelerate, and it accelerated across the Kaibab Plateau from the top down. You erode it from the top down, you see. That's why you don't have to use the low spots. You can do it at the top. It could have been, it's an intermediate altitude. A lot of water gaps are at the tops of through mountain ranges, cut through the top. So the convergence was a cut through the Kaibab Plateau. And, oops, that's a slide I didn't want to show, but I want to show this one. Like this. It converged and carved through at the point where Grand Canyon was formed across the Kaibab Plateau. Okay, the second problem is, notice Grand Canyon doesn't go down the topographic slope, which would be to the west. If I had my pointer, it would be going down that way. But it goes along the southwest edge of the Kaibab Plateau at the same altitude it cut through the Kaibab Plateau. How did that happen? Notice that there's some erosion to the southeast edge of the Kaibab Plateau, as well as to the southwest. What I think happened is that after that broke through, the southern tip of the Kaibab Plateau acted like a rock in a current. And when rocks are in currents, the water hits it and swirls around it and digs a trench around it. I actually can show some natural ones like this, but here's my artist drew this. It acted like a rock in a current and swirled around digging a trench. So you could, from the top and end up like that. But in the case of Grand Canyon, one current was stronger than the other. The one coming from the southeast was stronger, no obstructions to stop it. So it must have been going a lot faster than the one coming down from the northeast, because there's a lot of obstructions in the way. So it would be it wouldn't have been as fast, and so the erosion from this swirling eddies around this rock, the Kaibab Plateau, only eroded it a little bit on the southeast edge. But the major erosion was on the southwest edge of the Kaibab Plateau. This is blue still because we're underwater still. Actually, it wouldn't be blue. This water would be muddy and dirty. The floodwaters were like that. And then, I believe, that was a second problem formed. The third one is diverted to the west. Well, I think the reason that was the case is because you had a current coming down from that carved the Kanab Canyon and the Havasu Canyon, and from the east, and they all converged and forced the water to the west. So the Grand Canyon was formed towards the west. And then I believe the fourth problem, why it was diverted south, is because we had currents coming between two other plateaus coming down that hit the current going west to force it all south. And then we had other obstructions that forced the south current to turn to the northwest and leave the Grand Canyon area. So I think that's how Grand Canyon formed. And this is not so blue because, remember, the waters are draining. I'm trying to illustrate that too. But that's how I think Grand Canyon formed. I think it's fairly reasonable still. So anyway, in summary, secular scientists cannot explain the origin of Grand Canyon. They arrive at a consensus so far, but it is a really loose consensus. And I think it's mostly peer pressure type consensus. The dam breach hypothesis has fatal problems. I only showed you 3. I think there's a couple more that I don't show, and it has about 6 other difficulties that maybe they can get around. I'm not sure. But anyway, there are thousands of water gaps across the earth formed by flood runoff. And the Grand Canyon is just another water gap. And we should explain it by the same way that other water gaps are formed, being carved by the drainage of the floodwaters from the top down. Therefore, the Grand Canyon was carved by late flood channelized erosion. So we can explain the Grand Canyon. I think the explanation that I have developed is quite reasonable. So we can explain the Grand Canyon by late flood channelized erosion. Therefore, the flood, one of the most despised events by the culture, is a real event of the past. The flood's a real event. And if God can cause a flood, we can easily believe the whole Bible, which tells us how to live here on earth and how to get to heaven. And what does that last part look like about how to get to heaven? Well, you know, Romans tells you all about how to get to heaven. And I think that one of the best verses to summarize all this is Romans 10:9. It says, if you confess with your mouth that Jesus is Lord and believe in your heart that God raised him from the dead, you will be saved. Now, this is not just intellectual assent. These are commitment words. Believe in your heart. That's a strong commitment. In other words, you repent of your sins and accept Jesus' salvation on the cross and accept Jesus as the Lord of your life. That's how you're saved. That's the spiritual lesson of the New Testament. Anyway, the Bible encourages us that we're to be witnesses. Witnesses, and we're to be prepared to give answers. This culture is looking for answers. People are looking for answers. Young people, they're hammered all the time in schools. And by the way, 2/3 of young people after they leave high school don't return to the church. If you looked into the statistics from some of these polls, it's pretty shocking. And Ken Ham did a research to find out why they left 20-year-olds from conservative churches. And there's a lot of reasons, but the major reason was because of the age of the earth that caused them to doubt the Bible to start. And it started in grade school. That started the doubts. Evolution was secondary. These are the major reasons why they caused doubt. And doubt caused fruit. And he names his book Already Gone. In other words, they're sitting in the pews and they look like they're connected, but they're really not. In the mind, they're gone because they've been imbibed with millions of years and evolution from the culture. There's schools and books and so many other things, History Channel and so forth. So we're be prepared to have answers for ourselves, be able to answer questions for ourselves and for other people when we witness for our kids. But we're supposed to do that with gentleness and reverence. Gentleness and reverence. Arguing with people does not bring anyone into the kingdom as far as I know. And so as a result, we have all those resources because evolution affects practically every intellectual, what's the word I'm looking for, endeavor or of society, especially in college campuses. So if you want to know more about this particular topic, plus a lot more, I talk about the sedimentary rocks in the walls and other things. I'm just brushing this topic. Anyway, I wrote a book about it, a Grand Origin for Grand Canyon, if you want more information. And we got these spectacular national park guides. And we were on our way to do 2 more, but Master Books, the bottom line wasn't showing good enough, so they canned the project, unfortunately. So we got Grand Canyon out there, Bryson, Zion, and Yellowstone, and Grand Teton you can take a look at. And because I think geology is so important to learn, especially for young people, because that's a lot of times where they put it over on people, it's in geology. And it's hard for you to go out and check rocks to know what they're saying is true. Biology, it's a lot easier, but geology, it's tougher. So I wrote this book to teach us about basic geology so that when you drive around, you can see evidence for the flood. If you can see it for yourself out there, that greatly increases your faith and your children's faith. Biblical Geology 101, I wrote it with Robert Carter. And then specifically, how Noah's flood shaped our earth. In this one, I have a chapter on what the pre-flood world was like. We have some clues from rocks and fossils in the Bible what it was like. So I go through that. And since I'm passionate about teaching children about geology, I have 5 children's books back there. 2 on the Ice Age, 1 on weather, and these 2 Mr. Hibb, Exploring Geology with Mr. Hibb and Exploring Dinosaurs. What this is a fun read, especially for young people, an intelligent grasshopper going through all the details of the flood, teaching you about them in a fun read. So I'm going to end with this resource right here. Now, if you have a lot of questions, we have a lot of answers. And people ask us sometimes the same questions at talks. So we've gathered a lot of these, I think about 60 of them. And then there's 1 to 3 page answers to these. So if you have questions, we have answers. But there's still a lot of questions that need answering, which is why I'm a researcher. We're still trying to find these answers to things, but we do have a lot of answers. So if you have a lot of questions, there's a lot of answers out there. Anyway, I'm going to leave you with this verse right here. Your faith should not rest on the wisdom of men. The wisdom of men, that's what evolution millions of years are. They're trying to explain how we got here, how everything got here without God. So everything has to come about by chance, time, processes. The universe has to come about, the earth, life, and so forth. That's the wisdom of men trying to explain our existence without God. We shouldn't depend on their ideas, because science itself, in geology, earth science, which I study, there's a tremendous amount of evidence against it. But you got to learn a few things to be able to appreciate it, and when you read articles, to understand it. That's why I write on geology a lot. But our faith should rest on the power of God. God has power. If he can create in 6 days, it's no sweat to form a flood, and for Jonah to be swallowed by a large fish for 3 days. It's a no-brainer, no problem. But skeptics think these are really horrendous, difficult issues. But we got a God of power, do we not? And of course, we got those great websites where you can get some free information, like creation.com and answersingenesis.org. Creation.com has 13,000 articles for all age groups and all scientific abilities.